Murtagh, Murtagh, Murtagh. Has our Murtagh line come to an end? Who is Andrew Murtagh? For the answer to these and other exciting questions, keep going. You don't want to know? Stop. What I discovered over many years about the Murtagh family. Here's what the Murtagh family looked like at first. Well, at the beginning of my research, we already knew about John, Patrick, and Nan, or Mary. In my research, I later discovered their sister Honor, Mary John Hines, and then subsequently their parents, Michael and Bridget. The dying out of the line. The oldest child of Michael and Bridget was Honora, or Honor, born 1821. I found a reference to Sister Honor in a letter from John to his brother Patrick, and that's how I first learned that they had a sister. Honora married John Hines in Quebec. They had 3 children, Annie, Michael John, and Bridget. Letters from Quebec, 1888. The first letter was written in July of 1888, the second in August of 1888, and interestingly, Patrick died in September of 88. But in any case, in one letter, the first letter, I found the reference to a Bridget and a Michael, and the second letter to Sister Honor. And putting all that together and looking at census records and other records, I found out who they were. So first, Honor and John Hines. John died, her husband, before 1861, and the way I know that is because she is listed as a widow in the 1861 census, so he had to have died before that. Then Honor died of heart disease on 11 May 1885. Their child Annie died young in 1871 at 19 years old. Michael and Bridget moved in with Uncle John, their mom's brother, and neither of them ever married. Actually, Bridget moved in with them as well. All 3 of them did after John died, John Hines. Then at their deaths, that line came to an end. Here is the census record showing Honor and John and Michael, Bridget and Annie all living together. And then in the far right-hand corner, the column is marked showing Honor as a widow, and that's 1861. Now, John Murtagh. John was the youngest. He was born on 24 March 1836. He was a customs officer in Quebec. Sister Honora's children, Michael and Bridget, lived with him until his death on 18 November 1902. He never married either, so after he died, this line came to an end. Then our direct ancestor, Patrick Jeremiah Murtagh. Patrick was born about 1825, and he was the middle child. He was married in Quebec to Mary Jane Clark on 6 June 1854. When the Anglican bishop, Isaac Helmuth, became the Bishop of Huron, he took Patrick and Mary to London, Ontario with him. Patrick served as his coachman, and Mary was a servant. We, in our family, say that she was a governess to his children. And as we know, Helmuth founded what became the University of Western Ontario, and he served as coadjutor and ultimately succeeded Bishop Benjamin Cronin, who happens to be the great-grandfather of the actor Hume Cronin. This picture that's about to come up this is the census that shows Isaac Helmuth, who was a converted Jew, and he was born in Poland, and he was also a defender of the Orthodoxy, and then Patrick, Mary, and Michael in his household. Here's a picture that was in the Bible that Isaac Helmuth gave to Patrick and Nan in 1858. There's a picture of the home of Boys College that later became the University of Western Ontario. He served with and then succeeded Benjamin Cronin as Bishop of Huron, and there is Cronin's great-grandson, Hume Cronin, and his wife, Jessica Tandy. Now, we'll move on to Patrick's progeny. Patrick and Mary had Michael Jeremiah, their only child, in October 1853. Michael had Ernest Everard, Mary, or Mamie, Edith, and Carolina, Lina. Now, they are spelling their name Murtagh with a U. Ernest had 3 girls, Iva Maribel, Doris Merle, and Rosa Margarita Louisa. Doris died at 8 years old. And then comes the end of that line. Honora became a Hines, and her 2 children, Michael and Bridget, never married. John, the brother, never married. Patrick had 1 son, who also had a son, but then that son, Ernest, had 3 daughters. So the Murtagh name, at least, came to an end, meaning that none of the other Murtaghs in North America would be related to us. And so the line continues, but not with the name. Here is the way things look then. There's John and Honor, who had Bridget, Michael, and Annie. And then Annie dies, and John and Bridget never marry. Then comes Patrick and Nan, who have Michael Jeremiah, who marries Alice Isabel Bourne. They have Mamie Lina and Ernest Everard, who marries Mary Langford, and then they have 3 daughters, including our grandmother, and they all get married, or die, and so the Murtagh name ends. But there are other Murtaghs in Ontario, and the biggest but of all, I recently stumbled across a male Murtagh who lived in London, Ontario. Now that seemed to me to be too much of a coincidence, but how, if at all, was he related? So who is Andrew Murtagh? I first discovered a marriage record for an Andrew Murtagh from London, Ontario. Now, someone with the same surname and the same city at the same time, yet unrelated, is really not as unusual as you might think. Who could this Andrew be? So the search began for evidence. At the least, the presence of Andrew in London merits research to affirm or refute any hypothesis that he might be related. Gradually, a picture of Andrew's identity began to emerge. Just the facts, ma'am. Andrew Murtagh was born in about 1837. He married Mary Kenny in London on 31 October 1877. The first marriage record gave the parents of Andrew as Michael and Bridget Murtagh, same as Honor, Patrick, and John. Another coincidence? Well, maybe. The second marriage record gave his parents' last names. However, the transcription, which is not the original, it was somebody's typing out of what they were reading on the original, it listed the mother as Bridget Balma. So, was I on the wrong tree limb? Further research was necessary. So here's the first marriage record, the part in question here. Andrew Murtagh, 40 years old. He's getting married. He's from Ireland. He married, and his parents' names are Michael and Bridget Murtagh. Well, we don't have there the maiden name of Bridget Murtagh. His wife, Andrew's wife, is Mary Kenny. So further research showed more. Since there are often errors in transcription, I decided I would like to find the original document, which is sometimes hard to do or impossible, but fortunately I found it. And I saw that the surname transcribed Balmo was actually overwritten. B-A-L-L is seen in the background, but then another name is written in bolder hand on top, as if to correct it. It could be Bannon, but it is difficult to tell. Here's the line from that marriage record. There's Andrew Murtagh. There's Bridget and what I thought was Balma, but if you look very carefully, the two L's are in the background. It's kind of confusing in the middle as they try to correct it, but the last two letters could be a scrunched up O and N, and just kind of right up against the O, and then the letter before that is an N. It may look like a U, but the N's were a lot of times written in those days, came to a point like that. So it could very well be Bannon. So I learned more about Andrew. I discovered next that an Andrew Murtagh shows up in Brooklyn, New York, whose son, John Andrew, was born on 14 October 1878. Now, that didn't seem right. Is this a different one over in Brooklyn? But a series of later Canadian censuses do show that there was a John Andrew who was born in the U.S. but is back in London. So if all else fails, ask Mom. So I was getting confused, so I asked Mom whether she knew any other Murtaghs in London who were related. The answer, if what we had before was true, that all the lines came to an end, should have been no. But immediately she said yes. There were some very poor, large Catholic Murtaghs that she and Nanny would go see and help out, take things. She wasn't sure, but she thought that the lady's name was Lorna. The plot thickens. So I went back to the London census records and I found first that John, Andrew's son, country of origin was in fact the U.S. Later census records list one of his several children as Lorna. Here is one of those censuses. We can see John Murtagh and his wife Blanche and his daughter Lorna. And I think this was 1901. He was born in 1898 in the U.S. Blanche and Lorna from Canada. So with information like this, we can fill in Andrew's life. I further discovered that John's father, Andrew in question, died the year of John's birth in Brooklyn, where he is buried. Remember, he got married a little later, 40 years old. Then I found another marriage record for Andrew's wife, Mary. Apparently, what happened is that she moved back to London with her son John after Andrew died, and then remarried 6 years later. So, Andrew's death in 1879, there's the cemetery record in Brooklyn showing his death. So they leave all behind, and Mary remarries in 1884. Here's the line in question. It's actually one line in the record, but split in two. We see Patrick Burke, also born in Ireland, who's married. The end of that first line says Mary Murtagh, but she has the same parents as the one that married Andrew, John, Candy, and Mary. So this is the actual same person who is remarried. Let's take a look at John and his wife's brood. John has several children who grow up in London. The Lorna that I've already mentioned, also her sister Madeline, then John, Adolphus, and Michael. They appear in both census records and in baptism records from Ontario. When I looked very carefully at each of the baptismal records, and then at Michael's, John's youngest child, as you see above, I saw something very interesting. So here is first the census that shows the whole brood. Andrew, his wife Blanche, which is actually John Andrew. As you can see, they corrected it above. Blanche, Lorna, Madeline, John, Adolphus, and Michael, and his father-in-law happens to live with them as well, Charles Bibbings. Now, Michael's baptism, John's son. his youngest child. Look very carefully, and you see that Michael is born to Andrew John Murtagh, London and Blanche Biddings. And notice the sponsors, Michael John Hines and Bridget Hines, by proxy. So Michael's sponsors at the baptism were indicated as being in proxy, and the sponsors are none other than honors to children who were then living with Uncle John up in Quebec, Michael and Bridget Hines. That would explain the proxy, since they lived in Quebec, and the baptism was in London, and the spelling of Hines varied. You see it many different ways, often misspelled. So is Andrew related? It seemed unlikely that Michael and Bridget, who were descendants of our Murtaghs, could be sponsors from this family in London if they weren't related. Young John, Andrew's son, eventually moved to Windsor, Ontario, and that's where he died. His brothers also moved there, but the sisters stayed in London. And there are Murtaghs from Windsor today. Well, we always have to take contrary evidence seriously. In spite of all this, I still could not wonder why John mentions Honor, Bridget, Michael, and in his letter to his brother Patrick, but he never mentions Andrew. Well, that seemed to be a strange silence, unless they were estranged for some reason. Then I look back at the date, and on the letters and back at Andrew's date of death, really this is the order I did that. That's when I actually found out that he died in 1878. Well, John's letters were written to Patrick in July and August of 1888, so that explains the silence. Now we need to dig further and ask where the Murtaghs came from. There's still the question as whether it could be shown that Andrew came from the same place in Ireland as Honor, Patrick, and John. All of the records for the latter three consistently said Longford, but County Longford is very large, and there were other Murtaghs in the county and other counties. That's when I, as I shared with you already once, came across a reference in the Catholic record that said in the book, this book, History of the County of Middlesex, Canada, from the earliest time of the present, including a department devoted to the preservation of personal and private records, etc., from 1889, I there found the first and only reference I've ever seen to a specific town for the Murtaghs in Ireland, and it said on the 8th instant, that was September 1888, Mr. Patrick Murtagh, an old, highly esteemed resident of London, died at his residence in this city in October 1888 in the 63rd year of his age. He was a native of Ledwithstown, County Longford, Ireland. He has been in Canada 40 years, 33 of which he had been in the service of Bishop Elmwood. So that opened up a whole new door to finding out more about our relatives. So Ledwithstown, Ireland. We see first the map of Ireland and County Longford, and then we'll blow County Longford up in an old map and see there, and we'll then blow up from that Ledwithstown in the parish of Kilcommon, where they lived, and you see the town, Ledwithstown. Actually, there's two parts to it in two different parishes, but the part where our ancestors lived, you can see it is actually in kind of a crescent shape, very jagged, right in the middle. You see the numbers 2 and 3 and 4, right, and 1, right there in the middle. That'll be significant later. Now, we'll see that there has been little change in 200 years in Ledwithstown. There it is in 1835, and with now superimposed on top of that Ledwithstown today. And you can see it doesn't look like much has happened over 2 centuries, and there's a reason for that. Let's take a look at the Murtaghs and the land. Leadenstown was owned by the Ledwith family, hence the name. Plots of land were let out to poor farmers. Michael Murtagh was one of these farmers. Griffith's valuation of 1855, and another one earlier, shows the owners and renters for the purpose of assessing them taxes. So here's Griffith's valuation of 1855, and there's a page from Leadenstown, and we'll blow that up and see that there is Patrick Murtagh actually farms 2 plots that he's taxed for, Michael Murtagh, there, apparently sharing the field with Patrick Mulvihill. And again, both of them sharing another plot, and numbers to the right are the amount of taxes. The numbers on the left are map coordinates, so remember 9 and 10D. Michael Murtagh's farm in 1855, we said 9 and 10D. I don't know how much 10D encompasses there. It's subdivided. 9 is that whole section, the borders that you can see. And Michael Murtagh's farm, here's that map again, but we're going to take a look at the field from the north corner of the field, from the direction that the arrow is getting ready to point. And so we'll see from there. We are taking a look at what that same field looks like today. Certainly has not changed a great deal. We need to also understand something about the 17th century in Ireland. The parish where Leadenstown would be established is called Kilcamogue, and earlier it was called Kilcomick, and still later, earlier, Kildacamogue. When I looked at an old map, and the Westminster chimes in the background is a foreshadowing of something to come. Actually, it's my clock. But in examining an old map from 1650, I discovered what looked like the original owner of vast tracts of land in this very area. The following map shows that one of the primary landholders was none other than a Gregory Murtagh. So here's Gregory Murtagh's land up until at least 1850. And there's that crescent-shaped parish, only flipped upside down for some reason. And this map is upside down because all of the towns around it are parishes beside it. Like Rathcline should be on the lower left, and Tishanode should be up on the right. So each of those belongs to Gregory Murtagh, and the sections that have dashes in them are bogs, so it would be farmable because we're close to, I think it was Loch Ree, body of water. Now, the foreshadowing of the Westminster chimes, Ireland and England. So how did the land go from belonging to the Murtagh family to the Ledwith family? Well, first we need to note that the Ledwiths were Protestant and the Murtaghs Catholic. In the 1650s, Ireland lay in ruins after a dozen years of war that took the lives of 20% of the Irish population and practically destroyed the infrastructure. And that would also explain why there is not much there today. The Irish Rebellion, we note that. We remember that the armies of Oliver Cromwell were victorious over the Irish. He immediately began a massive transfer of ownership from rebel Irish Catholics to English Protestants. So in order to do that, he had the land surveyed, mapped, and kept very detailed records of all the land confiscations, probably more maps and details than any project ever done prior to this. There's a book called The Irish Landed Gentry, and in that we can see listed out the land confiscations from the Catholics, each listed by barony. The county Longford was further broken down into other baronies. Kildacommode was in the barony of Moydow. So the following page from that record shows who the Catholic owner was. Here's the page of land confiscations. We'll blow up to see the county of Longford, actually, in the barony of Moydow, and we see listed among those who had land confiscated is that very Gregory Murtagh. Nasty Protestants. So, the 19th century. By the 19th century, the Murtaghs had been reduced from noble landowners like Gregory to tenant farmers on what used to be their own land. To add insult to injury, the poor Irish tenant farmers were not only taxed, but assessed a tithe each year to support the Church of England. Now, things weren't difficult enough to make a living. Then the potato famine invaded the land. It went from 1845 to 1849. And that single watershed event resulted in 1 million deaths and over 2 million emigrations. So obviously that caused a rapid decline in population and eventually a change in politics, but now we can understand more clearly why not much has happened in these old farmlands. Here are the tithes that were required. In Kilcomick, we see Michael Murtagh and a Pat Murtagh, which could either be relative or his son, but not sure which, but they had to pay. Looks like £1.17 £1.17 shillings 6 pence. Then came the Murtagh emigration. So somewhere between 1847 and 1850, Honora, Patrick, and John left Ireland for Quebec to start a new life. Mary, Clark, Patrick Murtagh, and John Murtagh actually show up together in the 1851 census in Quebec. Patrick and Mary are not married yet, and John is only about 15. Patrick and Mary were married in 1854. So they had at least to be settled in Quebec by 1851 to appear in the census. Unfortunately, I found no naturalization or even passenger lists that I can actually see their names listed. But here's the 1851 census in Quebec, and we see clearly Mary Clark, so they're not married, Patrick Murtagh, and John Murtagh. They're laborers, I guess that's what the French word there means. Patrick and Mary's marriage, you see here, the marriage record kept by the church. It was actually a Protestant wedding, interestingly enough. So I don't know if they had one with the Catholic Church and one with, the Anglican Church working with Bishop Helmuth or what, but Patrick Murtagh and Mary, they misspelled her middle name, Clark. Murtagh married, it says in the left corner. Patrick Murtagh, the parish, Quebec, bachelor, and Mary Jane Murtagh. There they spell it right, in Montreal. So why is Andrew not among them in this census record? Well, remember that Andrew does not appear in any Canadian records until his marriage in 1877. The fact that his parents have the same names as the other Murtaghs in itself is inconclusive. Everyone and their grandmother from Ireland named their kids Michael, Bridget, John, and Patrick. So let's look at the deaths of Michael and Bridget, see what we can learn. And that was my most recent discovery, seems to put it all into perspective. I came across the death records of our Emerald Isle ancestors. The record not only shows where they died, but who was present at their deaths. Michael and Bridget's death. We see the page of the death record, 1871 when Michael died, and then 1876 when Bridget died. There's other church records. These are the civil records. Church records confirm that. But we see Michael Murtagh from Leadwellstown, 89 years old, died, and Andrew Murtagh was present at his death in Leadwellstown. He was from Leadwellstown, it says. And then of Bridget Murtagh, also from Leadwellstown, 86 years old, died and was a widow, it says. So this is his wife, Michael's wife. And Andrew Murtagh again was present at the death of his mother in Leadwellstown. So let the records show that Michael and Bridget Murtagh were from Leadwellstown. We know that, the Catholic record. The family member present with them when they died was one Andrew Murtagh. Again, what was the year of Bridget's death? 1876. When does the first record of Andrew appear in Canada? 1877. Conclusions. Andrew's parents had the same names as Honor, Patrick, and John. Michael and Bridget were their names. Honor's children were proxy sponsors at the baptism of Andrew's son, which would be strange if not related, especially living so far away from them. And Andrew Murtagh is present in Leadwellstown at the death of his parents, the parents of Honor, Patrick, and John. The very next year, after Mother Bridget died, Andrew Murtagh appears for the first time in Canada. So apparently had no longer had reason to stay in Ireland and joins his siblings. Furthermore, when I found Lorna Murtagh's marriage record, I asked Mom whether the relatives she knew in London got married, and she answered yes. I told her the surname of the marriage record of her husband, which was Riddick. She said yes, that was her name. Therefore, I believe that it is reasonable to add Andrew and all his descendants that I can find to our family tree. This also means that we should be able to discover living relatives in London, though with other surnames like Riddick, and in Windsor, where the boy Lorna's brothers had settled, with the surname Murtagh, and perhaps many other places. And in fact, I've been busy and finding all kinds of obituaries and records of those who are relatives from Windsor. And so here's the family tree, at least the first three generations, Michael and Bridget Murtagh with her children and her grandchildren, Honor, John, Patrick, Andrew, and then Honor's children, Bridget and Michael, who move in with John, and then Patrick, who has Michael, and Andrew, who has John, Andrew, and marries Blanche and has Lorna and her sister and brothers.